Today we are going to explore one of the greatest misconceptions hanging over everyday life in the Middle Ages. The idea that medieval peasants subsisted on a diet devoid of flavor, seasoning, and any culinary refinement. Before we continue with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There is an image that persists in the popular imagination whenever someone mentions the Middle Ages. It is a dark, damp image of muddy streets and exhausted people hunched over steaming cauldrons where something of indefinite appearance bubbled. In this view, food was merely fuel, survival, a scarce, bland, and unvarying resource consumed without pleasure and without ceremony at the end of an exhausting workday. This image has extraordinary power. It spans centuries, appears in textbooks, in major studio film productions, and in casual conversations among those trying to imagine what life was like before modernity. And it almost always carries an implicit premise that those people simply had no access to flavor, that their food was flavorless out of necessity, devoid of spices, variety, and culinary intention. But what history actually tells us is something very different. In recent decades, researchers, archaeologists, and food historians have been examining a growing body of evidence. Parish records, monastery inventories, medieval recipe books, organic residues found in excavated vessels, market documents, and travel accounts from travelers who crossed Europe between the 9th and 15th centuries. What these sources reveal, with a consistency that is quite surprising, is that medieval cuisine was not merely functional. It was, in many ways, sophisticated. Not sophisticated in the way we are accustomed to associating with the great European courts, of course. When we speak of the peasants, we are referring to a specific reality: men and women who tilled the land, who depended on the seasons, who lived within a subsistence economy marked by natural cycles of abundance and scarcity. But even within these real and concrete limitations, there was a wealth of flavors that popular history insists on ignoring. Salt, for instance, the substance that gives name to the myth we will investigate throughout this documentary. There is a widespread belief that salt was a luxury item inaccessible to the common medieval peasant, and that its absence was the main culprit behind that supposedly bland and characterless food. This belief has recognized historical roots. Salt was indeed a strategic product, controlled by empires, taxed by kings, the object of trade agreements and supply routes that crossed the European continent. There are medieval records that prove how much its commerce moved fortunes and influenced the fate of entire nations. But to conclude from that the medieval peasant ate without salt is a considerable logical leap. And it is precisely this leap that contemporary historiography has been questioning with increasing rigor. Because what the sources show is that salt was present in medieval everyday life in ways that are not always obvious at first glance. Not necessarily in the form of refined crystals on the table, but integrated into fundamental preservation processes. In the fermentation of vegetables, in the curing of meats and fish, in the preparation of cheeses and legumes in brine. In many regions of medieval Europe, salt was an accessible product through local trade routes, produced in coastal areas or extracted from rock salt deposits inland, redistributed through market networks far more dynamic than common sense usually imagines. And salt was just the beginning of the story. Because behind the myth of saltless food lies something even greater: the assumption that the medieval peasant had a passive and resigned relationship with food, a relationship of simple acceptance of what was available, without deliberate choice, without refined technique, without a gastronomic culture worthy of the name. It is this assumption that the next chapters of this series will challenge, based on concrete and verifiable historical evidence. We will tour the medieval vegetable gardens, communal kitchens, local markets, and ecclesiastical records to understand what peasants actually put on their tables, which herbs they cultivated, which preparation methods they mastered, which flavors structured the rhythm of their daily lives. Because understanding what a civilization eats is perhaps one of the most honest ways to understand it in all its human depth. And the Middle Ages, as we shall see, have much more flavor than history usually tells. To understand the place of salt in the life of the medieval peasant, one must first undo a confusion that popular history has committed over centuries, the confusion between the strategic value of a product and its inaccessibility to the common consumer. Salt was expensive as a large-scale commodity. It was taxed, disputed, and controlled by powers that saw in it a permanent source of revenue, but that does not mean it was lacking on the table of the one who worked the land. Let's start with the numbers. In 13th century medieval France, supply records of villages and parishes, analyzed by historians such as Josiah Russell, suggest that an adult peasant consumed on average between 8 and 10 kilograms of salt per year. This data does not describe a population deprived of seasoning. It describes, on the contrary, a population that depended on salt constantly for something far beyond flavor, the preservation of food that would see them through the winter. And here is a key to understanding medieval daily life that the simplified view of the era often ignores. Salt was not, for the peasant, an optional culinary accompaniment. It was a survival technology. Without it, the pork slaughtered in autumn would not last until winter. The fish caught in summer would rot before reaching the months of February and March, when food reserves were at their most critical. The vegetables from the garden could not be preserved beyond the season in which they grew. Salt was, therefore, a necessity as fundamental as the seed planted in spring. And medieval populations, however simple their living conditions, knew this with a clarity forged in the experience of generations. The question, then, was not so much whether the peasant had access to salt, but where that salt came from and what its cost was within a local economy. And here the story becomes more interesting than one might suppose. Medieval Europe was, in terms of salt production, a surprisingly diverse continent. Along the Atlantic coasts, from the Bay of Biscay to the Portuguese shores, extensive salt pans produced salt by solar evaporation in large quantities. In inland Central Europe, rock salt deposits had been exploited since antiquity, and regions like Salzburg, whose name carries the element within it, functioned as redistribution centers that supplied entire territories. These sources of production fed commercial networks that, although less visible in historical records than the great spice routes of the East, were equally vital for European daily life. Specialized merchants traveled roads and rivers, transporting salt on carts and riverboats, selling it at periodic fairs and at local markets present in practically every medieval borough of any relevance. It is true that the medieval state quickly recognized the fiscal potential of the product. The French gabelle, a tax on salt that remained in effect for centuries and would become one of the sparks of the French Revolution, is the best-known example of this state control. But even under tax pressure, salt continued to circulate. Taxes made the product more expensive, but did not remove it from the lives of the lower classes. Inventory documents from 14th century rural villages, studied by historians such as Barbara Hannawalt, record the regular presence of salt among the goods of peasant families, sometimes in modest quantities, but consistently. Salt appears in these documents not as an occasional luxury, but as an item of household stock, listed alongside stored grain and the few cooking utensils those families owned. Understanding this fact substantially changes the image of medieval daily life. It does not erase the real difficulties those populations faced, nor the harshness of a life marked by intense labor and vulnerability to harvests. But historical research is clear. Salt was just one among many flavor elements that peasants handled with ease, within a culinary culture far more vibrant than the myth of bland food could acknowledge, because there was an entire universe of flavors cultivated literally around the houses. A universe that more recent historiography has been recovering with growing enthusiasm, revealing a relationship with cooking that was far more active, creative, and rich than the medieval stereotype suggests. We are talking about medieval kitchen gardens, those small green territories that surrounded peasants' houses throughout virtually all of Western Europe and were, in fact, true living laboratories of flavor and nutrition. It was there that much of the secret of peasant cooking resided, and it is there that our investigation turns in the next chapter. If there is a space that popular history of the Middle Ages consistently ignores, it lies right behind the peasant's house, a small territory bounded by wooden fences or hedgerows, where dozens of plant species grew in an order that seemed chaotic, but was in fact carefully managed. It was there, in that space that medieval texts called the hortus, that much of the flavor of peasant cooking had its origin. The medieval kitchen garden was not a spontaneous invention. It was the accumulated result of centuries of botanical knowledge passed down from generation to generation, refined by practical observation and necessity, and recorded in documents that have reached us with surprising integrity. One of the most revealing of these documents is the Capitulare de Vilis, an edict issued by Charlemagne at the end of the 8th century that listed with remarkable precision the plants that should be cultivated on imperial estates. The list includes more than 80 species, among them aromatic herbs, vegetables, medicinal plants, and fruit trees. It does not represent the daily life of the humblest peasant, as it refers to royal properties, but historians use it as a mirror of what was known, cultivated, and valued in that world. And what this inventory reveals is extraordinary. Parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, marjoram, fennel, mint, celery, dill, coriander, cumin. These were not exotic rarities reserved for the tables of the powerful. They were plants regularly cultivated in domestic gardens, present in the records of rural monasteries, and mentioned in medieval culinary texts as everyday ingredients, combined naturally in the preparation of stews, soups, and breads. Beside the aromatic herbs, there were the vegetables: onion, leek, garlic, cabbage, turnip, parsnip, pea, and bean. These were the vegetable pillars of the peasant diet, cultivated not only as a source of calories, but as carriers of flavor and of properties that medieval folk medicine recognized with clarity. Garlic, for example, was widely used both in cooking and as a remedy, and its presence in medieval household inventories is so frequent that food historians describe it as ubiquitous in the European peasant kitchen. Onions and leeks appear with disconcerting regularity in historical records. In medieval lease contracts, it was common for part of the payment to the landowner to be made in kind, and not infrequently these payments included onions. This reveals something concrete about the relative abundance of these foods and about their economic value within a rural community. But the medieval vegetable garden was not merely a space of production. It was also a space of knowledge. The women who managed these gardens, and records indicate that this was predominantly a female responsibility in the medieval rural context, possessed a vast and functional botanical repertoire. They knew which plants combined well, which best seasoned meats, which preserved foods in brine or vinegar, which alleviated coughs and stomach pains. This knowledge was not trivial. It was the result of an oral and practical tradition, accumulated over generations, existing in parallel with the medical and botanical texts that circulated in monasteries. And it translated directly into a kitchen that, though humble in material resources, was sophisticated in terms of flavor combinations and technical mastery of what the land offered. Historian Paul Friedman, one of the most respected scholars of medieval food, points out that the distinction between rich and poor food in the Middle Ages was less a matter of taste than of quantity and animal protein. Peasants had access to aromatic herbs and vegetables of a quality comparable to that of the upper classes. What separated them was access to meat, white wheat bread, and exotic spices from the East, not the presence or absence of flavor in daily life. This distinction is fundamental. It repositions the medieval peasant not as a passive victim of a diet imposed by poverty, but as an active culinary agent, working within their resources with competence and creativity. Someone who knew the plants around them, knew how to combine them, understood the cycles of the harvests, and organized their pantry with a planning that often determined the difference between a reasonably nourished winter and one of severe deprivation. And this culinary competence was not limited to what grew in the garden. It extended to grains, to bread, to thick soups and porridges that formed the true heart of medieval alimentation. It is upon this core of the peasant diet, as misunderstood as the question of salt, that we focus in the next chapter. If there is one food that defines the Middle Ages more than any other, that food is bread. Not the bread we imagine, soft, light, made of refined wheat, taken from a well-heated oven, but a dense, dark bread, often sour from prolonged fermentation, heavy in the hand and in the stomach, made from rye flour, barley flour, or a mixture of grains that varied according to the season, the region, and the fortune of the last harvest. This bread was the absolute cornerstone of the medieval diet. In good harvest years, an adult peasant could consume up to 1 kilogram of bread per day. Historians of medieval food, such as Hans-Jürgen Teutoburg, estimate that grains accounted for between 60 and 80% of the total caloric intake in the European peasant diet. They were the foundation upon which everything else rested: the herbs, the vegetables, the dairy, the eggs, and the occasional portions of meat. But understanding the role of grain in the medieval diet requires unraveling another layer of the myth, because when people speak of medieval bread, many imagine something akin to the white wheat bread we know today. And that image is fundamentally mistaken. Refined white wheat was, in the Middle Ages, an expensive product with restricted access. On the tables of noble families, the wealthiest monasteries, and cities with high purchasing power, white bread appeared regularly. But in the villages and on the farms, where the vast majority of Europe's population lived, what went into the oven was a far less selective flour. Rye, barley, oats, millet, and spelt were the peasants' grains, cultivated because they withstood cold, drought, and pests better, and because they could be stored for months with relative stability. Rye deserves special attention. In northern and central Europe, it was the dominant grain in the peasant diet between the 10th and 14th centuries. Its bread was dark, dense, with a characteristic acidity that came from the fermentation of natural leaven, and which peasants considered not a flaw but a quality. It was a bread that sustained, that filled in a way that light wheat, less nutritious in its refined form, could not always manage. And besides bread, there was the porridge, the thick soup, the grain stew known in English as pottage, which, in its regional variations across Europe, accounted for a huge portion of the peasant's daily caloric intake. Medieval pottage was not a food of resignation. It was a deliberate preparation, seasoned with herbs from the garden, with onion and leek, sometimes enriched with legumes like peas and fava beans, and carrying its own culinary logic. This logic lay in efficiency. A single cauldron suspended over the fire could feed an entire family with minimal fuel and effort. The grains softened and released starch that thickened the broth. The herbs infused aroma, the legumes added protein, and the result, though modest in appearance, was nutritionally functional in a way that the medieval subsistence kitchen had learned to maximize over generations. The medieval recipe collections that have come down to us, although almost always linked to monastic or aristocratic kitchens, record variations of this type of preparation that reveal considerable technical sophistication. Combinations of herbs that balanced bitterness and sweetness, the use of vinegar or wine to acidify and preserve, the toasting of grains before cooking to deepen the flavor. Simple techniques, but ones that demonstrate that the medieval peasant was not indifferent to the final result of what he put on his plate. There was also a political and social dimension surrounding the grain. The mill was, in feudal Europe, the property of the lord of the land, and peasants were obliged to grind their grain there upon payment of a fee. This control over milling was a concrete form of power over the population's food supply, and it generated conflicts, negotiations, and tensions that appear frequently in medieval documents. Grain was not just food, it was an instrument of power. To understand this political dimension is to understand the medieval grain in its fullness. It nourished but also governed. It distributed but also subjugated. And it is within this complexity that the peasant diet fits, not as something passively given, but as something negotiated, cultivated with effort and defended with the tenacity of those who knew that without it, there was no tomorrow. But the medieval peasant's table was not made only of bread and porridge. There was, besides the grain and the garden herbs, a protein dimension that popular history tends to drastically underestimate. The story of how those people obtained and prepared meat, fish, and dairy is as rich in contradictions and surprises as everything we have explored so far. There is a particularly stubborn misconception about the medieval diet that goes beyond the myth of salt and dark bread. It is the idea that the medieval peasant simply did not eat meat. That animal protein was an absolute privilege reserved for the nobility, and that those who worked the land lived in a kind of involuntary vegetarianism, imposed not by choice, but by the structural poverty of their lives. This image does not hold up to confrontation with historical sources. It contains a grain of truth, Access to meat was indeed lower among peasants than among the nobility, but from there to claiming it was non-existent is a considerable distance, one that contemporary historiography has been traversing with increasing precision. The most honest starting point for this discussion is the pig. Among all domestic animals of the European Middle Ages, the swine was the one best adapted to the peasant economy. It required no pasture, fed on scraps and forest fruits, grew quickly, and at the end of autumn offered an enormous caloric return proportional to the investment made. The slaughter of the pig in late November or early December was one of the most important moments in the medieval rural calendar. It was an event that brought the community together and ensured the protein reserves that would sustain the family through the coldest months. And the medieval pig was utilized with impressive completeness. The noblest cuts were cured with salt. The bacon was preserved by smoking. The less noble parts were turned into sausages, seasoned with local herbs and spices. The offal was consumed in the days immediately following the slaughter. It was a food economy of total utilization, in which almost nothing was wasted, and salt, once again, appeared as a central character. But the pig was not the only path to animal protein on the peasant table. Domestic fowl, and chickens in particular, were an absolutely common presence in medieval backyards. Chickens produced eggs with a regularity that made them a low-cost, high-frequency food resource. Medieval agrarian contracts often included clauses about the delivery of eggs as part of the payment to the landowner, confirming the widespread presence of these birds on peasant properties. There was also fish, and here the medieval history of food presents one of its most surprising dimensions for the contemporary eye. The medieval religious calendar was structured by an impressive number of meatless days, the Fridays of the entire year. The periods of Lent and other minor fasts added up to between 150 and 180 days annually, in which meat consumption was forbidden by the Church. On those days, fish was the main substitute. For a population that followed the liturgical calendar, with the seriousness that the Middle Ages demanded, fish was not an occasional food, it was structural, practically mandatory for nearly half the year, and the consequence of this religious obligation was the development of a fishing and conservation infrastructure of enormous sophistication for the time. The rivers of Europe were a primary source of protein for the peasants who lived near them. Carp, eels, trout, perch, and other freshwater fish were regularly caught, eaten fresh or preserved with salt, and smoked when necessary. In coastal regions, salted herring and cod arrived via trade routes, at prices accessible even to the lowest strata of the population. Archaeologists have found herring remains in excavations of inland medieval villages, situated hundreds of kilometers from the sea, concrete evidence of a distribution chain far more efficient than common sense would assume. And then there were the dairy products. Cows, goats, and sheep's milk were regularly turned into cheese and butter, as historical records clearly confirm. Cheese, in particular, was a food dense in protein and fat, easy to preserve, and affordable, appearing with remarkable regularity in household inventories, monastery records, and lease contracts of the era. What emerges from this body of evidence is a diet that, though more limited than that of the nobility, was far from the monotonous, resource-deprived fare that popular imagination has enshrined. It was a diet of cycles, of strategies, and of intelligent use of everything that the environment, the agrarian calendar, and religious obligations made available throughout the year. And it is precisely this calendar, this organization of time and flavor across the medieval seasons, that reveals perhaps the most unexpected aspect of this entire story. It is to this that we turn in the next chapter. To understand medieval food in all its depth, one must learn to think as a medieval peasant thought, not in terms of isolated days, but in terms of cycles, the cycle of the seasons, which determined what grew, what could be harvested, what needed to be preserved, and the cycle of the religious calendar, which determined what could be consumed on each of those days. These two calendars, the natural and the liturgical, overlapped and intertwined in a way that shaped the medieval diet with a precision that today is difficult for us to imagine. The first great reality of this calendar was seasonal scarcity, and it had a name and a very specific period, the soudure, a French term used by historians to describe the interval between the depletion of winter stores and the beginning of the new harvest. This period, which stretched from March to July depending on the region and the year, was the most vulnerable moment of the medieval rural calendar. The grains stored the previous autumn were running out. The winter vegetables had been consumed. The animals that had survived the cold were not yet in condition to provide abundant meat, and the new harvest was still months away. The soudure was not a historical abstraction. It appears in medieval records as a feared and concrete reality. Rises in food prices, ecclesiastical records of alms distribution to vulnerable populations, and social conflicts related to access to food resources. For the medieval peasant, getting through the soudure was, in some years, a matter of careful management of stores accumulated months in advance. And it is precisely this anticipatory awareness that reveals something profound about the medieval peasant's relationship with food. It was not passive. It was an ongoing practice of planning, of observing the harvests, of calculating reserves, of making decisions about what to preserve, what to consume immediately, and what to save for the most difficult months. Autumn, in particular, was the season of action. It was when the pig was butchered and salt entered the scene to cure and preserve. It was when the grains were harvested, threshed, and stored. It was when fruits were dried, cheeses aged, and vegetables pickled. The vegetable garden was emptied methodically, and everything that could be stored was stored. The medieval autumn was not a season of rest. It was the season in which the coming winter was managed in advance. Winter, in turn, was the season of restraint. Resources were distributed carefully over the cold months, and the menu inevitably became more repetitive. Dark bread, grain porridges, dried legumes, cured meats and preserves. But even here, there was culinary intention. The dried herbs of summer, the aged cheeses, the smoked sausages with the concentrated flavor of autumn. Spring brought gradual relief. The first sprouts from the garden, the eggs from the hens in steeper rhythm as the days grew longer, the fish in greater abundance after the thaw, and summer presented the widest variety of fresh vegetables of the year, wild fruits, mushrooms from the forests, herbs in full bloom, and the first grains of the new harvest that announced the end of vulnerability. But the medieval calendar was not made of natural cycles alone. The liturgical calendar imposed upon it a second layer of structure. Days of fasting alternated with feast days, and the feast days held an importance that went far beyond the religious aspect. They were occasions for community gathering, for sharing food, for expressing collective identity. The days dedicated to the patron saints of villages, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, were moments when the peasant table was transformed. The higher quality bread appeared. The reserved meats were prepared with greater care. Wine or beer circulated with a generosity that daily life did not permit. These moments of relative abundance had a precise social function. They reinforced community bonds, established hierarchies and reciprocities, celebrated the collective survival of yet another cycle of seasons. Food on feast days was not only better, it was also more laden with meaning, with memory, with belonging to a group that had traversed together the hardships of winter and the vulnerability of the soudure. To understand this rhythm of contraction and expansion, of restraint and celebration, of planning and sharing, is to understand the medieval peasant in a way that no isolated inventory of ingredients could offer. It is to understand a civilization that built, with the resources it had, a coherent, adapted, and deeply human food culture. That is what we propose to conclude in the final chapter of this series. Throughout the last chapters, we have traversed a territory that popular history rarely visits with the attention it deserves. We went from medieval saltworks to domestic vegetable gardens, from feudal mills to feast tables, from rye porridges to the herring that crossed the entire continent in carts. And what this journey revealed is something deeper than a mere historical correction. It revealed a civilization. But there is still one last layer of the myth that deserves to be examined before we close this investigation. It is the question of spices. The idea persists that pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and ginger were exclusively reserved for the tables of the nobility, and that the peasant lived in a world of flat flavors for lack of access to them. This image has a factual basis. Exotic spices were indeed expensive, arrived in Europe as prestige goods, and carried symbolic value beyond the gastronomic. A sack of black pepper could be worth the equivalent of weeks of work for an artisan. It was evidently not a product of the peasant's everyday life. But the spices of the East were just one category within a much broader universe of condiments. Mustard, cultivated throughout Europe since antiquity, was an accessible and widely used seasoning. Caraway, juniper, wild celery, and fenugreek grew in household gardens or were gathered from the fields, and their intense flavors played a role in humble kitchens, analogous to that of exotic spices on aristocratic tables. What separated the peasant seasoning from the noble seasoning was not the presence or absence of flavor, but the geographical origin and social prestige of what aromatized the food. The peasant did not aspire to pepper, because the juniper picked by the roadside fulfilled a similar function within his culinary logic. And that logic, as we have seen, was far more refined than the myth of flavorless food could ever acknowledge. We have arrived at the end point of this investigation, and it places us before a question that goes beyond food. Why did the idea of the medieval peasant as someone deprived of flavor and culinary culture become so firmly fixed in the collective imagination? The answer is, in part, a matter of sources. The medieval history that has come down to us was written by those who knew how to write: monks, clerics, and nobles. The peasant's voice rarely appears directly in these documents and must be reconstructed by inference from inventories, contracts, tax records, and archaeological finds. This documentary invisibility was interpreted for centuries as an absence of culture. But absence of written record is not absence of life. It is also a matter of historical perspective. The Middle Ages were long narrated from the top of its hierarchy: battles, cathedrals, theological treatises, and palace intrigues. The daily life of ordinary people was treated as a backdrop, not as a protagonist. When historians such as Marc Bloch, Georges Duby, Barbara Hannawalt, and Paul Friedman turned their gaze to that daily life, what they found was a human richness that traditional narrative had systematically underestimated. The medieval peasant who emerges from this research is not a figure of privation and passivity. It is someone who knew deeply the land he cultivated, who mastered sophisticated preservation techniques, who organized time according to natural and religious cycles, who celebrated around the table, and who negotiated his subsistence with tenacity and creativity. And the food that this peasant prepared, seasoned with garden herbs, preserved with salt as accessible as it was necessary, enriched with fish on fasting days and pork on feast days, structured by the grains he carried from the field to the mill and from the mill to the oven, was an expression of culture as legitimate as any banquet described in the great illuminated manuscripts. Demystifying medieval food is not merely an academic exercise. It is an invitation to look at the past with more honesty and respect for the complexity of the lives that preceded us. It is to recognize that flavor was always present where there was humanity, and that the Middle Ages, with all their harshness and beauty, had far more on the table than history usually tells. If this series has awakened in you a curiosity for these forgotten territories of everyday history, leave in the comments which aspect of medieval life surprised you the most. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next narratives, and leave your like as a way of telling us that it's worth continuing to explore these silent chapters of the human past. Every comment and every subscription is our suja, the reserve that allows us to get through the months and keep producing for you.